Welcome to this morning's discussion hosted by the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership here at Oxford Brookes University's online Creative Industries Festival 2022. As you may have noted from the pre-event publicity, I'm not Daniela Gennari, nor am I John Newbegin, who were both previously planning to support this morning's discussion. My name is Rob Panting and I'm the Communications Manager at Oxford, and I'm delighted to be chairing this upcoming panel discussion. Both Daniela and John send their apologies for not being able to make today's event and wish us well. As you'll have seen from the event programme, this morning we will be asking the question, how can we embrace the creative and cultural sectors as a driver for high street rejuvenation? Pre-COVID-19, the creative industry sector contributed over £100 billion a year to the UK economy, with Oxfordshire home to almost 4,000 digital and creative businesses alone, a significant and dynamic force within the industry. In light of the pandemic, there is a general recognition that traditional high streets should be reconfigured to respond to a new reality and a different use of space. Recent data says that while 75% of our council-funded projects are within 5 minutes of the high street, just 10% of high street businesses in the southeast are in the creative sector. However, there might be a change happening. A creative High Streets report from last month suggests that 18% of new businesses on South East England high streets are now classed as creative. Here to discuss this important topic are our distinguished panel. Firstly, Andy Edwards, who is Director at Makespace Oxford, Anya Meinhard, Artistic Director at Justice in Motion, Paul Hobson, Director at Modern Art Oxford, and Claire Cumberledge, who is founding director of Claire Cumberledge & Co, but this morning is representing DAX as director of its Artworks project. Good morning, panel. Prior to answering the first question, each panel member will also give a brief overview of their organisation too. Firstly, before we move on to our panel, in addition, I will note the opportunity for you to ask your questions too, provided through this Zoom event. Please do leave your questions in the Q&A facility, and I'll bring these comments into the discussion later on this morning. Okay, back over to our panel now, and Andy, if I can start with you. First question is very much built around the close relationships between cultural venues and our towns and cities. Given this close relationship, how critical is it for the sector to work for the benefit of our local economies? And can they assist in building a better society moving forward, particularly post-COVID-19? Over to you, Andy, and please feel free to talk about Makespace Oxford too.
Great, thanks, Rob, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, real pleasure to be invited and to be here to share a few thoughts. So for those of you that aren't aware, Makespace Oxford is a community interest company, and we're concerned with transforming empty and underused space and buildings into community-driven workplaces, places that work for the local economy and the local community. And we do that primarily through what's called meanwhile use. So that's the temporary repurposing of empty buildings to act as a catalyst for longer term change. So yeah, we love the topic, and we're kind of living it and breathing it, and working with these questions every day. We have the great privilege of working across Oxfordshire with a real plethora of different organisations that would make up what you call the kind of creative and cultural industries. And we think they are fundamental to the recovery that we are wanting to try and instigate, and that they have a fundamental role to play, not just in transforming local economies, but in kind of resetting the landscape. It's often talked about as kind of, you know, the new normal, and actually the question is maybe what do we need to rethink and redesign. And some of the ways in which we're trying to do that is through terms that are becoming more commonplace. So not just about economic recovery, but thinking about inclusive economic recovery, and being quite explicit and clear about what these things mean. So when it comes to inclusive economy, that's the idea of an economy being intrinsically married to social goals, where there is an intentional desire to actually reorganize the economy with wider ownership and where it functions naturally to produce social and environmental justice. So we're not talking about tinkering around the edges, but we're talking about a fundamental redesign. And another term that we work with very closely is around community wealth building. And that's a kind of new people-centered approach to local economic development, which directs wealth back into the local economy. And we think that the creative industries, first of all, that we come with that the mindset that everyone is a creative, everyone is a designer, and the people who are best to drive that change are the experts, and the experts are the people who live in the towns and cities that we're working in. And so first of all, we need to listen to them and harness their creativity, but do that through this lens of reshaping our economic climate and the places in which we want to live and work.
Thanks, Andy. Anya, good morning to you. If I can bring you into this, the discussion, what's your take?
Good morning. Maybe also to just explain who I am. So I'm the Artistic Director of Justice in Motion, and we are a physical theatre company. So we have not got our own building at all, which means that we are much more positioned in enlivening the high street and other places as well. We'd love our own space eventually, but at the moment we don't. But yeah, our work is very much centered around social injustice and human rights issues. So all of the work that we do raises awareness about that, inspires people to take a stand, hopefully, and also really engages within the debate and the discussion. And I would say that for me, definitely the arts, like Andy was saying, just are vital, absolutely vital. I think we cannot live in a society without the arts, without the beauty that the arts bring, without the understanding that an artistic approach can bring to things as well. The creative brain is a very different one. And what the arts can do, and why it's so important, especially after COVID now, is it can really encourage empathy. It can encourage a better understanding for one another as well. Seeing things through a different lens is really important as well. And that's something we can do through the arts. There's a really beautiful quote from Leonard Bernstein, which I just want to share actually. It says, "The point is that art never stopped the war," which is quite poignant right now, "and never got anybody a job, but that was never its function. Art cannot change events, but it can change people. It can affect people so that they are changed, because people are changed by art. They are enriched, ennobled, encouraged. They then act in a way that may affect the course of events by the way they vote, they behave, and the way they think." And I think that sums it up really beautifully, that we can influence people in a really positive way, hopefully moving forwards to just be more with each other, people at the center. Again, just resonating what Andy just said, and yeah, seeing the world in a different way, like the what if it could be like that. We don't have to, remain in the confines that we are. We don't have to only focus on economy, capitalism, education, whatever it might be. They're all important, but we do also want to encourage the arts. And another picture that really struck with me during the pandemic specifically was that, I don't know if you saw it maybe on in social media, the picture was very apparent, where you had a theatre space versus a plane, where in a theatre we had to have 2 meters distant in between, whereas in a plane we were able and okay to just be crammed next to each other just with our masks. And just it highlighted for me massively the discrepancy of the flights, and that needs to remain to fuel the economy, whereas the arts weren't seen quite the same way. And so I'd love that to be different.
Thanks, Anya. Paul, over to you. I think Anya and Andy both made very good points around perhaps the people aspect when it comes to having much greater recognition of the creative and cultural sector. Feel free to give your take.
Thanks, Rob, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Paul Hobson. I'm the director of Modern Art Oxford. We're a contemporary art organisation that some of you may know. We're based just off in the city centre, 5 minutes from the High Street, along with all of those other 70-odd% of arts organisations funded by the Arts Council. So we benefit from close proximity to the High Street, and obviously the footfall of the high street. As an organization, we work with artists all the time, mostly living artists, sometimes with artists that are no longer with us from the 20th century, but our focus is on modern and contemporary art. And so we're working with artists all the time, and of course, absolutely relate to what Anya is talking about in terms of the individual agency and the transformation that an engagement with art offers, both inspirationally, educationally, in terms of well-being, all of these benefits which are undoubtedly arise from art and culture. My view, I suppose, about the role of art and culture on the high street is that it is a fact, really, that art and culture contributes really significantly to placemaking agendas, creating a really distinctive sense of place, helps cities and towns to develop their brands, their identities, enhancing the historic character or the histories of various areas, celebrating regional communities, different communities, helping to shape the places where people want to live and to work and to play, and those communities. They also play a really central role in skill development and education, in adding, of course, to the quality of life, the quality of place and healthy living. I mean, there's really clear evidence that the arts and culture contribute towards well-being and public health. So there's a huge amount, without a doubt, that art and culture offers more generally, and specifically, of course, the siting of that on the high street is an important way to regenerate the towns and cities, which are, of course, as we know, their high streets have been so in decline in recent years and accelerated by pandemic, as well as obviously, online shopping and increased business rates and inflation, austerity, stagnant wages, all of these things, parking, lack of infrastructure, all of these things have contributed to the decline of the high street, and arts and culture can play an important role in all of those aspects and in creating compelling experiential offers that people are looking for now, just beyond a retail offer or an entertaining offer. Some of you will be familiar with the High Street Renaissance report that was produced by the Arts Council last year that did a survey of the UK population, and 62% of people said how much they enjoyed and had a sense of pride of having arts and culture on their high street, and 50% of those who were surveyed said that they would like to see more cultural activities in their high street. So there's a clear win-win here in terms of the types of outcomes and benefits that can accrue from arts and culture on the high street, and public appetite for those to be developed. And of course, all the commensurate economic gains that come with that. So this is a very important conversation, and hopefully it's something that in Oxford, beyond the work that Make Space and others are doing, there are many other towns and cities across the southeast, Colchester, Chelmsford, Harlow, very many of them, and of course in Oxford, that are looking at different models, which perhaps we might discuss, of giving that presence into shopping centres and high streets, and in a variety of different ways. So very much welcome being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Paul, and delighted that you're here this morning too. Claire, good morning. Over to you. What's your initial take?
Good morning. I'm Claire Cumberledge, founding director of Claire Cumberledge & Co. But today I'm particularly talking around a programme called Artworks, which has been established by DAX. DAX is the UK's leading arts rights management organisation. It was established in 1984 by artists for artists. It's a not-for-profit, and it's about the financial well-being of artists. So I endorse everything that the panel have been saying about the values that artists bring to our society, socially, culturally, economically. And Artworks as a programme has been developed to look at a new model in which these abilities of artists might be enabled to flourish. So your question originally referenced arts venues, and we've started from a different starting point. we're looking at a relationship between artists, local authorities and communities, so a three-part relationship. And Artworks is, we invited local authorities to be part of it, and we're working closely with Derby and Liverpool, who are both contributing significant financial and human resources to the programme. And the idea is that we will take over a number of units within their town. Well, in Derby, it's within the city centre, and in Liverpool, it's in a city edge in an area of deprivation, that we will take over units on the high streets, pay artists a living wage for a year to inhabit those units. Some of the artists will be established artists and some will be emerging artists. And our ambition is that it's a best practice programme. So the artists will be supported to give of their best work. They will be supported both, curatorially and socially, but also through connections with the local councils to enable them to make the connections they need to make. And our belief is that through this programme, we will be enabling artists to release their visions, to reset and renew society post-COVID. So I guess that I'm interested in how we can develop these new models that support artists to give of their best within this context of cultural, economic and social rejuvenation.
Thank you, Claire, and that moves very nicely onto the second question. When you talk about enabling those working within the creative and cultural sectors and ensuring that there's recognition of the wider impact that the sectors can have. Andy, back over to you. And again, this is very relevant, I think, in relation to the work that Makespace Oxford is delivering. Is the creative industries and cultural sector often forgotten about when we think about the potential knock-on effects to other sectors too, particularly in relation to retail and hospitality? Obviously, I think the work that Makespace Oxford do has probably never been more relevant. Some initial thoughts on that?
Yes, in short, I think it's such a challenging one because it's often exclusion by design or by default. It's a system that's not set up at the moment to celebrate, cherish, value all the wonderful things that the panel's already kind of set out. And we're still very much, the high street is led by a market economy, and it's based around exchange and profit. And so I think there are so many offers that are being made from creative industries, but the challenge is to harness that and also think about how we can at the same time influence for longer term systemic change. And so to kind of change that conversation, as I said before, sort of redesign the terms of engagement. And I think, that's why working through the lens of something like the inclusive economy, there's an opportunity there to shift what we just consider to be value. And I think COVID has accelerated that and has forced that discussion in a way that we've never had to have it before, because we suddenly lost access to our high streets, and then we suddenly lost the fundamentals of what provides meaning and joy as humans, which is around harnessing one another's creativity and harnessing connection. And so whilst that's still front of our minds, I think we have this opportunity to try and foreground as quickly and as much as possible all the different offerings that we haven't seen on our high streets in too long, and through that kind of diversity and energy and excitement and recentering of what we want our towns and high streets to be, hopefully, and I remain skeptical but hopeful that we can actually invite longer systemic change. But we must not see this as just a moment and an isolated opportunity that can pass us by, but we have to force the discussion, and we have to really champion it and be loud and confident in our voices, that our towns and cities, we've lost a sense of what they're for and who they're for, and so we've got an opportunity in a moment, hopefully post-pandemic, whilst there are these plethora of empty buildings and the market doesn't quite yet know how to recover from what's happened, to insert a new narrative into the city and do that as a sector and a citizenry, and to hold on to that longer term.
Thanks, Andy. Anya, in your first response, you really focused on the importance of the cultural offering to people and the impact that it has on people. Obviously, in relation to this, it's talking about sort of knock-on effects, positive knock-on effects to other sectors too. But is the draw, or should the draw continue to be on what impact cultural offerings can have on people and uplift the economy from that perspective?
I think you can look at it from different perspectives. I would say I can speak more confidently from the people perspective because I'm less dealing with the figures and all of those stats. But I just feel that, or think that within COVID times and the pandemic and the lockdowns especially, we really could see how artists were at the forefront in helping with their well-being and bringing art into people's homes, in shifting very quickly our approaches. Like, we would usually be performing in theatres, that wasn't possible, so we invented different things. And again, that's the creative mind, right, that was immediately challenged and brought to the fore, that we can approach things differently and that we can still bring art and creativity to people. And again, just seeing the images of people singing on the balconies and there being community, and we hadn't lost that, or creative packs being created and being sent to people's homes, or a performance happening over the telephone, or just different ways of still engaging people. And that was, I've heard from a lot of people that was their lifeline. Even just, we were running dance classes online, which is not the same as when you're in a space together, but it still was a lifeline. Those weekly classes were a lifeline to a lot of people that helped them through that isolation, through the pandemic and so on. One project as well we did was very much focused on loneliness and how that impacted people. It wasn't initially meant to be as a result of the pandemic, but it exacerbated it. And so we interviewed over 20 people on their experience, and just taking them through the process and then seeing how they engaged with it, and how much just seeing the artwork that was created for them, the dance videos, changed their perspective and helped them to overcome their loneliness, to connect with others through that, and to see others, but others' loneliness in a way portrayed, but also how much movement and music can bring people together. I won't tell too much about the project. If you want to see it, it's called Moving Together on our website. But that's just something that struck me, that the arts were very much at the forefront, as well as community and helping the community, those two things really. And then it's really sad to see that now, especially in education, the provision of the arts is just being zapped out. And so, in schools, arts are being taken out further and further and further. And I really fear that going forwards, we are raising a generation right now of young people and people that don't really connect to the arts anymore, that don't necessarily see the value and have the understanding that maybe there is not a job within the arts and I can't really make a living within the arts, because that is what our society nowadays really promotes. And that saddens me, because as Paul mentioned earlier, the arts are everywhere. It's about how we promote, our towns. It's about well-being and health. It's about the design and the architecture and the structures. It's everywhere. The arts are everywhere. So if we take them out, and if we take out this understanding and appreciation for it and the valuing of it, it's going to be a very, very gloomy world. And I do not want to live in a world without input from the arts. And hopefully we can shift and change that perspective slightly, not slightly, drastically, actually.
Yeah, I think everybody on the panel and probably in the audience would absolutely align with those views and the importance of arts to the wider community. Paul, just picking up on Anya's point there around, I guess the physical position of arts opportunities and cultural opportunities within towns and cities. Obviously, most people who have visited Oxford would be aware as to where modern art Oxford is situated. It's very much within the city centre. It plays an important role for the city. What's your take on, I guess, the wider need for cultural offerings within our community, and perhaps going back to the original question slightly, the wider impact, the knock-on effects to our city and towns and their economies too. Obviously, proximity for you in and around places like Westgate, the covered market, of course, which is very much a champion of independent businesses too. Sorry, quite a few questions there, Paul, but I'm sure you'll cover them off ably.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because actually we often feel that we're rather invisible in the city. We're sort of tucked away, and unlike other like the Ashmolean, which obviously is very prominently cited in a building, we feel a bit overlooked. But you're right, we do have hundreds of thousands of people that come to Modern Art Oxford, and we know enough from our audiences to know that a third of those are local, a third are national, and a third are international, and we're definitely an important engine, along with all of the arts and culture and heritage offer of the city and the county, really important in driving the visitor economy, the 7 million people that in pre-COVID times would be visiting. That offer is really important. My own view is that we're not often promoting that as effectively as possible. In general, that's perhaps another conversation about the systemic structures that are around cultural promotion that is different in different regions. But I think that we could be doing a lot more to be making the case for arts and culture. And as a sector, it's something that we have to be doing all the time, of course. I don't know that we do it very well, unfortunately, because we are often seen as the soft option. And of course, for those of us that work in the sector and think strategically, and also have a responsibility to advocate for arts and culture and its importance, we have a really good understanding about the relationship between our programming and our activities and the impact, the wider impacts, some of which we've already been talking about. But I think it's not unreasonable to acknowledge also that for people that engage with the arts, they're punters, they enjoy it. They're inspired. It's an evening out. It may bring them into the town centre or to enjoy, to have that personal subjective encounter. I don't think most people are thinking about in the way that I would do about the impacts of art and culture. So we've got to make that case more strongly. And just returning to the observations about the pandemic, I don't know whether or not in a situation where there's been such a radical withdrawal, of course, of arts and culture, all the things that make life worth living. I mean, if we can imagine a world in which you can't go to the cinema or to the theatre or go and, just go dancing, anything that is about that self-expression. I think that the profound trauma that we've all been living through has actually been the withdrawal of all of that over the last couple of years. And of course, a foregrounding of all the really essential services, the National Health Service, mental health service, all of these things which are really critical. So I don't know whether or not art and culture have come out badly, actually, on the back of the pandemic. Artists weren't key workers, creative practitioners and freelancers weren't key workers. They weren't prioritized as being important. In fact, for me personally, one of the most distressing things over the course of the pandemic has been the the hardship that's been experienced by people that work in the arts, by freelancers, by creative practitioners, by artists, people who already eke out an existence on like 8 or 9 grand a year, typically, so it's, I don't know that in this withdrawal, whilst people have really noticed that lack of inspiration, social connection, all of the things that they would usually do that form part of being in the world and engaging with contemporary life, I don't know whether or not people have made the connection between the trauma of that being withdrawn and the importance of what arts and cultural organizations need to do. And I think we are responsible for that. We have to make that case. And we certainly have to make that for artists who are still, many people have left the sector and they're doing other things because it's absolutely unaffordable. There are issues with the pipeline. Anya's referring to the low status really of the arts in the curriculum. And yet, we're all trying to work towards a more inclusive sector where some of these things are working counter to the equality and social equity agenda that we all have as organizations. So it's a complex mixture, but I think that we've got to make the case for arts and culture. It isn't a given. And for people that use the high street, which is a very democratic space, there's an opportunity for us to make that case, to really engage audiences and to reach new audiences that currently aren't coming into my building at the moment because they're actually on the high street. If I take my offer there, then actually that will really contribute towards something that's more socially inclusive and also will result in more opportunities for artists. And all those things I think are really important on the back of the pandemic in particular. So very long ramble, I'm afraid. It's like rant about poor artists, but there's so many that are experiencing such appalling hardship. It is very distressing.
I teed you up with a long question, Paul, so you're fully justified in giving a long answer. That's absolutely no problem at all. Claire, finally to you, I guess there's been lots of different areas touched upon there, the importance not just for the local economy, but the importance around well-being, the importance around community. What's your wider take?
Well, thinking about reflecting a little on Paul's comments around artists and how the pandemic impacted on artists. This Artworks programme came out of research that DAX undertook during the pandemic with over 12,000 artists. And it really confirmed what we all know about the precarious position in which artists live and work. 73% of artists reported that their livelihoods had been affected by COVID. 54% reported a fall in sales. 47% weren't eligible for government support. 40% reported cancellation or indefinite postponement of projects. Really the impact on artists was enormous. After doing this research, DAX then crowdsourced a manifesto for artists and identified 5 key priorities for artists, which include living wage, art being included in the curriculum until the age of 16, access to free space. So a number of demands made by artists, which have formed a manifesto, and Artworks is part of that. So DAX are doing a lot of work around campaigning for the rights and value of artists. What's interesting on our programme is that some people are understanding the value and recognising the value more than others. So, for example, the local authorities of Derby and Liverpool are contributing very significant resources from their reserves into this programme because they so clearly see the value that artists can bring to the issues within their cities. And as part of the expression of interest, they had to say why they wanted to be part of it. And you couldn't have got a more articulate explanation of how artists can help to rejuvenate our cities and against what need. In contrast to this, we've been unsuccessful in gaining Arts Council funding. And this is absolutely incredible to me. We had over £600,000 existing monies, working in areas significant to levelling up, working with young people who are not within the normal, we had hard to reach and emerging artists. We were only asking for 300,000 and we've been turned down twice. And this just demonstrates to me the ultimate lack of vision that currently is in place in the national funding for arts system. It seems to me that at the moment, arts funding is all about sort of maintenance and trying to hold what's there, instead of having a really big vision of how art can be supported to contribute more holistically to society. And I don't know if any of you were aware, some of you may be, of this truly amazing program that's recently been announced in America called Creatives Rebuild New York. And it's $125 million towards supporting artists' futures. They're doing it in two ways. They are going to appoint a 2-year program for 300 artists across the city of New York, artists working with community organizations and being paid $65,000 a year. And then a second strand of it is guaranteed income for artists, where they pay artists £1,000 a month to support their practice. And the narrative around Creatives Rebuild New York is so uplifting and hopeful, and reflects all that we know that the arts can do towards the regeneration of society. And reading that makes me very much wish that we had a shared level of vision in this country. And I don't feel we have. I think we've got all of these amazing pockets of activity. Many of the people, well, all the people on the panel here today are examples of that, really incredible projects and artworks and institutions. But at a higher level, in terms of funding and support, we're really missing that big vision.
Thank you, Class. And as you say, some quite difficult statistics there to absorb and understand, I think, particularly those that might not be in the midst of the creative and cultural sector, and understanding the challenges there. I guess moving on to the next question, very much with those statistics that you've just mentioned, Claire, in the forefront of our minds. As I mentioned in the introduction, there is a statistic that's been recently announced to suggest that 18% of new businesses on South East England high streets do classify themselves as creative. Andy, coming to you first, is that encouraging? But I think probably caveated with the statistics that Claire has mentioned. Do we need to do more to encourage greater representation of cultural and creative offerings on our high street, even if the initial statistics are at least relatively positive moving forward?
You won't be surprised with an answer of yes again, obviously, of course. Is it encouraging? I think it's disheartening, actually, that it's so low, and that shows the kind of the cultural and creative poverty in which we exist on our high streets. And I just keep coming back to that question of what's the high street for and who's it for. I was really interested to hear Paul's comment about this kind of the notion of it being a democratic space, and I love that idea, but I don't relate to that assessment at all. And I think perhaps it was maybe first envisaged in that way, around agoras, around marketplaces, around the coming together of people. But now I think it's actually just an area of exclusion, and we've run community research projects which discuss this with grassroots creatives and artists and community organisations who just feel like Oxford's city centre, its high street, is not for them. And there's nothing there that represents them, and there is no physical space for them. And that's a narrative that we see time and again. Of course, that's why, meanwhile, in Oxfordshire, the programme is trying to make available physical space, because we're not, we have seen so many brilliant projects through the pandemic, some of which have been touched on, and Claire's in particular sounds extremely exciting, about shifting from creativity that sort of managed to overcome this disconnection that was wrought by COVID, and now we are seeing these really heartening programs about inserting or supporting artists to take up residency on the high streets. But they are, as Claire says, they're so peripheral, they're so marginal. My goodness, that the Artists Rebuild New York project sounds absolutely phenomenal, and I think an ambition anything short of that is doing us a disservice, and we're the ones that are losing out. But we've got some hard work to do to convince those who currently hold the power and make the decisions to demonstrate that everyone's losing out. They are too. And it's a really interesting tension and dynamic that we're navigating when we have to liaise. Make Space has to liaise with landlords day in, day out to have these conversations about their empty buildings, and many of whom are so detached from place, from the impacts that their building may or may not be having, both positive and negative, that you've got chasms to straddle, and so I think encouraging, no, somewhat disheartening. We must have a much bigger ambition. I totally agree with Claire there. I would love to see a return of the high street being a democratic space where we can have conversations about what art, whose culture, who's visible, who's invisible, and have that the primary function of our high streets and our cities now, because we no longer need it for the archetypal industries that it was built around trading and exchange. We've actually seen that those industries can pivot very happily to a decentralized economy where deliveries go straight from producer to consumer. And so let's think about what the city is actually for now, in place of the Boswells and the Debenhams and the Pounds shops. In place of those, that provides us with enormous amounts of space and opportunity, where creative and cultural institutions should be the thing that defines a city centre, and represents the full diversity on offer there, and isn't just a few kind of institutional actors, anchors that are kind of publicly funded, but actually is also creating space for these very precarious artists and creatives who currently yet have no access to these spaces.
Thanks, Andy. Anya, I noticed you nodding along to a lot of the points made by Andy, and an applause to the New York project that Claire referenced earlier on too. I think earlier on you also mentioned the importance of physical space and securing physical space for those working within creative and cultural settings. Further views on that?
Just resonating with everything that Andy was just saying, to be honest. I'm not sure if I can contribute additional thoughts, but as an artist myself, and being in a much more precarious situation, whilst also running a company, an organization, a charity actually, and having to supply for a lot of other people and being responsible for their incomes too, that really resonates with me. Like, I would love to see a scheme where we have a basic income, basically £1,000 a month. That would be fantastic, to just have that as a basic salary, and then we can create based on that. So I'd love to see that. But also, indeed, just thinking of Oxford, during the pandemic, and even now, it seems sometimes almost like a ghost town. All of the city center places, the nice shops that were there, they're all disappearing, mostly due to the Westgate, probably because everything has been concentrated there. And if you like big shopping malls, then that's fantastic. And there's a lot of offer there, which is great. But all of the nice, quirky little places within the city center are evaporating, disappearing. And that's really breaking my heart. There's nothing that I'm drawn to even coming into town for. I have recently moved very close to getting to town, just in Italy. And I thought I'd be in town all the time, and I'm really not, because I'm much more enjoying the little pockets that we have in Italy and Cowley. So I think a lot of people probably feel the same way and would love to see, different smaller places and more independent places spring up again, and more artistic places and creative spaces. I mean, I love what happened within the covered market and different artists playing different gigs and so on, which is fabulous. But you kind of have to know about it in order to encounter it, come across it, because again, it's tucked away within the covered market. Physical space. I'll probably talk about that maybe later, but it would be so great to have a hub where artists can come together. And for example, we have the museums, which is fantastic. And I think there's a big draw, you've got the cafe in Modern Art Oxford as well, which is beautiful, or at the Playhouse even, in the theatre. But then to have like a hub, a dance space where only dancers, for example, not only, but those people interested in dance could come together and just hang out, and maybe have the studio space available and just try out a few ideas, and then have a coffee afterwards and chat a bit more. Where mothers can bring their children in as well, and it's not a place where they wouldn't be welcomed. That would be really nice to see. So hubs where we could just merge and come together, that would be something that I'd love to see. And then very much so resonating, Andy, with what you were saying, who is designing the spaces, who is actually who's designing the spaces that we're wanting to see, because I'd love to see different art forms as well, different art. Like right now, even just looking at our panel, we are very white yet again. And so I'd love to see, more African art come through, or I don't know, just something that's different, that's not typical Oxford. So where are those voices in the mix and in the conversation, in the creative conversation as well? That is something I'd love to see. And then finally, just an example from Denmark. They have, in every town, they have Parkour Parks. So I don't know if you've seen any of our work, we love doing parkour. That is one of the physical forms that we use in our shows. And there's barely any access, and people jumping on buildings and, over walls and all of that is maybe not quite as welcome. Whereas in Denmark, there is parks everywhere, and it's just part of their physical expression. And you walk a few miles and there's another park. And so I'd love to see that in Oxford as well, Oxfordshire. Where just more places where we can just be physical and engage and just jump on things and further our well-being and physical health as well. I'm going to shut up now.
Some really very interesting points there, Anya, and certainly the comparison to our European neighbours, I think, is very stark in many ways, and obviously drawing upon the example that Claire mentioned around New York too, and how things are done differently in different parts of the world. Paul, coming back to you now, again, lots of different areas I think discussed there around availability of physical space, the cost of the physical space, the way in which we embrace creative and cultural openings within our towns and cities. What's your take on, as I say, maybe some potential green shoots? As Andy said, we can look at stats in many different ways and be, I think, discouraged by that too. What's your take?
Well, actually, I'd be really interested to see the stats, and I'd love to know, the direct contribution that artists are making or creatives are making to the high street to increase footfall and the economic and well-being impacts of that. I think, I assume that we're either building that data set or it exists. Certainly, I know in the case of DAX, I had the pleasure of hearing Claire present to the Oxford Local Enterprise Partnership, probably about maybe a year ago, Claire, I can't quite remember when that was. But there was a clear enthusiasm, but a sort of a skepticism that unless there was a really tangible data set to show the impact of these schemes, in all the way that we're claiming, then I think there's a degree of skepticism in a situation of people dealing with, standstill funding, local authority. I mean, Modern Oxford's had a 30%, cut from the Oxford City Council. So, our ability to keep doing things and to be working in communities or on the high street, or even in our building, is actually quite challenged quite often, even though we're better funded than most organisations, without a doubt. So I think there's definitely an ambition and an opportunity for us to be doing all of this work, but there needs to be a really sustained investment on a far greater scale. I think that's clear from what everyone's saying on this call, but that will only happen if we're able to make the case in really clear and compelling terms that other funders, certainly landlords, will understand. I think the other thing that's really important, and just from my own experience, is that artists need real security. They need proper security for where they're working. There's a long history of artists coming into areas, working in a very improvised, contingent way in areas, then being regenerated, priced out, and then moving on to other areas. And I worry about schemes that actually don't provide artists with those opportunities to have long-term, secure livelihoods, either from an economic point of view or practice development point of view. Certainly for the claims that we're making around communities, they don't happen overnight. They happen over years and years. And the investment that needs to go into that needs to be really sustained. There needs to be security of tenure in those buildings that are being available, because otherwise artists will just be kicked out. As soon as rents can go back up, they will be deprioritized from those spaces, and that I have to call that out. But in order to really scale up and to have that security for artists and practitioners and really meaningful placemaking contributions and work with communities, you're talking decades really of investment. And so, but that is only going to happen if we as a sector make the case, we show the evidence, we show what can be achieved. And fortunately, there are now reports. There is evaluation that is showing this benefit, but we've got to be doing that much more effectively than we are as a sector at the moment, especially given all the other pressures that are facing not only the sector, but also, of course, local authorities and other funders. So I don't want to sound pessimistic about that. I'm just, in my own view, saying what I think needs to happen for us to achieve the kinds of scaling up and sustained investment that will really be beneficial for artists and also for communities.
Thank you, Paul. Claire, just again picking up on a couple of Paul's points around the sustainability of the sector and wider sectors, I suppose, but also the need to continue to elevate actually what the sector offers across a multitude of different areas. What's your initial take, and would you like to see further opportunities given to creative and cultural openings and giving them the opportunity to elevate themselves on our high streets?
Sorry, just unmute myself. Just in an immediate response to Paul, the project I was working on with DAX prior to the pandemic was the Artist Land Agency, where we were looking at building houses, a new model of home ownership for artists that would be a mix of home and workspace. So this is slightly developed out of that. So I think as a sector, we're aware of those dangers of a kind of exploitative or extractive approach to artists and their relation to regeneration. And I think sometimes there are problematics around the idea of meanwhile. And I'm sure, Andy, you're very aware of these. And that whole, that practice has to be very well managed. And I think increasingly that is well managed with people who understand. I don't have an in principle objection to the idea of meanwhile, because I think as long as the artists are clear about the terms of engagement and they are operating in that way and are supported to do that, that's fine. My response to this question might be slightly rambling rather than structured. I have never had a problem in convincing property owners to engage with a program. They're all very happy to give their space because they can really clearly see what value it brings. And I think that's what opens the door to exploitation in a way, because they really see it. And I think you're right, Paul. I think we've got to be much smarter about gathering data and sharing it so that we're doing it strategically on a national level to help us make the case instead of doing it in a piecemeal way. To respond to something that Anya was saying about new models and hubs, I wanted to briefly reference a project I launched maybe 4 or 5 years ago in Lincoln called Mansions of the Future. And it was in partnership with Lincolnshire Co-op. Lincolnshire Co-op gave us a building for 3 years, and it was inhabited by a series of artist commissions and community initiatives. But critical to its success was that we commissioned Catherine Bohm, an artist, to do the architectural design for that space. And it was the most welcoming space that I've ever been in. It really was amazing how it didn't matter who you were walking into that space, you felt welcome. And for me, that it was like a positive vision of what a new form of community could be, where the program encompassed everything from there was an artist working with the local prisons and the Defund the Police program. We had a food bank working in there. We had local councillors coming in and doing their council meetings in there. It really was an amazing vision of a shared space. So I would endorse that idea that through these kind of visionary cultural spaces can give us an image of how we want society to be and how we want to develop. But to endorse what Paul is saying, we also just need to get a hell of a lot smarter about gathering the data and demonstrating that value in a way that will convince national government.
Thank you, Claire. And again, lots of very interesting points, particularly I think around, and Anya touched on it too, around the collective creative and cultural hubs and trying to explore how they evolve. Certainly there's lots of examples across the UK around collaborative spaces across a variety of different sectors, and particularly when it comes to innovation and science and technology. And I think that's certainly something that can be absolutely explored when it comes to creative and cultural and really putting meaningful thought behind that. Absolutely. Before I move on to the next question, just to encourage everyone to continue to use the chat bar. We will come to it in a moment to review some of those questions. There's lots of activity in there, lots of different reference to events coming up, which Andy's put into, which is excellent. We will come back to that very shortly. Wanted to, yes, Andy.
If it's all right, I just wanted to keep sort of building on points that are being raised.
Sure, please do. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, really enjoying the discussion from others on the panel, and as you say, would love to hear more from people in the chat. I think, yeah, just on that idea of us concentrating our energies, our capabilities, our capacities, whether it's in a physical form around hubs. And I wasn't aware you were involved or fundamentally involved in Mansions of the Future, Claire, but that's such an inspiring project. So yeah, really lovely to hear a bit more about that. But also about this bringing together our resources, and I think in that regard, recognizing our comparative platforms and privileges in this space, and how we actually leverage those to, as a piece of work I'm doing with a group of other artists and cultural institutions at the moment, about trying to understand what a more radical future of solidarity looks like, whilst we're being forced to compete for ever reducing funds, as sort of Paul and Claire have alluded to, and a withdrawal of the state in financing and supporting arts and cultural sectors. You know, how do we actually club together to show greater solidarity and generosity, particularly for smaller organizations that don't have any kind of art-based basic income, whether that's from the Arts Council or from kind of other cultural entities. And so I think that's a challenge for us, is to think very critically about our own role and our positionality, and to think about, particularly when looking at studies the Pomoja Trust has just done, looking at Oxford, and how such a minute proportion of the COVID recovery funds have gone to BAME-led organizations. There is no kind of umbrella cultural institution that represents the global majority, and there are great efforts being made to think about how we can create one. But in the meantime, all of the money is going to often kind of the established partners and majority white-led organizations. And so I think, how can we, even in this sort of terrain where we're kind of fighting for our own positions, can we actually be more generous and demonstrate more acts of solidarity rather than compete, as we're being encouraged to do so? And I think, just on the point around meanwhile and the tension around meanwhile, I think it's so important to recognize it's not an end in itself, and it's not a panacea, and it's fraught with risks. And so it has to be seen as a process that goes alongside much longer term community-led place-based renewal and regeneration, with the ultimate end being about shifting who owns and has access to the city. So how can we actually end up with these workspace hubs, like Mansions of the Future, rather than that being a meanwhile lease of 3 years, being an asset transfer freehold, a community buyout, which then means that actually these places on our high streets are owned by us, and not constantly held by existing entities. So I think, yeah, I always welcome and I'm open to critiques around meanwhile, and want to be really clear about understanding the kind of both the opportunity as being a catalyst for change, but also the great risk about being exploited and exploitative to those that are currently in already precarious situations.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, and I think certainly from the points you raise around the importance of projects like Meanwhile in Oxfordshire, obviously they don't lose their significance, but it's really a starting point for how our towns and cities need to evolve in the future. And there's lots of different subtopics there, which we could have several panel discussions around, and certainly something that's something that we can take forward as a local enterprise partnership. Absolutely. I think it's probably worth coming on to some of the audience questions. So thank you everyone for putting those across. It's great to have the engagement and the willingness to take part in the discussion. One of which actually is a question that we had lined up as well for discussion. So it's probably worth touching on that now. And it's the question from Alan Reeve. So thank you, Alan, for your for your question around the whole levelling up discussion. And from an Oxford perspective, continuing to recognise that actually, you know, despite many perceptions of Oxford and Oxfordshire, actually we do have areas of our communities that that are feeling the pinch at the moment, you know, very much so, and also the need to you know, create opportunities for all of our communities too. I know it was mentioned previously by one of you. Forgive me for not making note of it, but the need to engage our BAME communities and to demonstrate the opportunities that the creative and cultural sectors in Oxfordshire can generate for them. But more widely, in terms of discussion around levelling up, I guess, what influence can the creative and cultural sector provide to that, and where do we think the sector more generally sits within that discussion? Anya, perhaps if I throw this one to you initially, and then we'll go to the wider panel. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is great opportunity in the agenda, in the levelling up agenda, that we can bring the arts into it more, and that we can engage especially communities from the global majority, and I'd love to see that. But I think it's really important to note as well that it's not about just saying this is happening in Oxford City Centre, for example, and therefore everyone come here, but to see how can we level into the different areas within Oxford as well, where, you know, other communities, or communities, I don't like other, sorry, communities that feel more comfortable in their own spheres. How can we bring more creativity into those places as well, whether that's Barton, whether that is Cowley, whether that's Blackbird Leys and so on. So to not just invite people, but to offer and go and see what they want to grow in their communities as well. I don't know if that gives enough of a point, but yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Paul, what's your view? I think in terms of, I guess, trying to inspire all communities, but also recognising, you know, the genuine role. We've mentioned some of the financial figures around what the sectors can generate and what that means in terms of levelling up. What's your take on I guess the wider viewpoint? Sorry, that's quite a lot to unravel. I appreciate.
Well, I think the levelling up agenda, I mean, it's Oxford is certainly not a priority within the levelling up agenda, and of course we can point, as you have done, Rob, to high levels of socioeconomic deprivation and diversity in Oxford in particular. And looking more widely, of course, across Oxfordshire, obviously it's a different mix once again. So, but Oxford, you know, no matter, we may want to make the case about those high levels of deprivation, but when you map them against other levels across the country, they don't make a very compelling case, unfortunately. We are very fortunate in Oxford to have incredibly amazing arts heritage and culture organizations, and as others have said, none of that investment, none of that infrastructure or investment has gone into organizations that represent practitioners or communities that are from the global majority. That's like a historic issue that needs to be corrected, but again, it requires a really sustained strategy of investment, of de-investment in some cases, which of course is a feature of the Arts Council's approach at the moment. Certainly if you're looking at London, there's a huge millions of pounds of worth of de-investment that will need to happen in order to enable the levelling up agenda nationally as well. So, but the sense that I've had from my conversations with the Arts Council has been that Oxford isn't seen to be a priority at all in terms of the levelling up agenda, because we have really amazing arts and culture and heritage in the city, but it is very white. The infrastructure is completely white, really, and we're not going to change that overnight. What I think is really very beneficial about Oxford is that there's a really close network actually of partnerships and collaborations and a collegiate fabric between the arts and cultural organizations of the city and increasingly across the county. And that again has got enormous potential, but there needs to be really meaningful investment and support to build spaces and also organizational capacity to really level up that agenda over a long period of time. And all the direction of travel is actually about standstill, about reductions in funding, if anything. So I'm not, again, I don't want to be pessimistic about that. I hope I'm being realistic. We need to give a new shape really to the forms of investment that we have in a context where public funding will probably be reducing, if anything, over the coming years. For all the reasons that we know, local authority pressures and on the back of the pandemic. So I think that for all the claims that we make as arts and cultural organisations, there's massive inequality in our own sector, and it mirrors the inequalities that there are in society at large. And whether we're going into communities in Blackbird Leys, or if we are going online, we all know that those digital inequalities are there. They're there on the high street as well. The point that was made earlier about the inequalities or the lack of democratic space of those things. So I think we've got some systemic blind spots, I think, also as a sector in terms of the inequalities of investment in infrastructure. And I think we are looking at a sea change on the back of the pandemic, because those things have become much more apparent. And the social equity movement that we're all working within is also demanding that something's done about that. And that's, of course, absolutely right and long overdue. But it requires really sustained and meaningful investment in spaces, in communities, in professional practice for those artists and those other practitioners. And it's a much bigger topic even than what we're doing on the high street. Maybe, in some cases, the high street's the starting point, but actually it's, you might question whether or not that is the right starting point for doing some of this transformational work.
Thank you, Paul. Claire, coming across to you, you've referenced in a number of your answers so far different examples from other parts of the country and the impact and the role that the creative and cultural sectors play in those locations. Is there anything that is perhaps happening in other parts of the country, in the projects that you're involved with or have sight of, that is playing its part in levelling up? And is there something that we can take forward perhaps as an Oxfordshire community?
I think there's levelling up as an aspiration, and then there's the government's levelling up agenda, and those are two very different things. And I think there's an enormous amount of work happening nationally around forefronting cultural practices that previously have not been validated or represented. One of the aspirations around artworks, I mentioned it briefly earlier, was that it would be a best practice project in terms of supporting the professional development of the artists. So that would be both the established artists and the emerging artists. And it's incredible, really, the way that artists go through art school and then are sort of thrown out into the world with all of the claims that we have made for artists today. They go out and have to deliver those with very little professional development or support. And so often there is either burnout or lives become too economically precarious for people to be able to continue. So I do think we need to look at a systemic change if we are going to truly level up and enable people who don't come from privileged, middle class, financially comfortable backgrounds to sustain a career in the arts. yeah. And I'm saying that as a woman in my late 50s who comes from Yorkshire, and there was never anybody in the art world with a northern accent, and there's still very few of them now after, you know, nearly 40 years of being in practice. So I think we've got a long way to go.
I think it's a very fair point, Claire. You know, again, as a white male who's been brought up in West Oxfordshire, you know, opportunities have always been there for me in careers that, you know, I want to explore. And I think it's a much more holistic discussion, particularly when it comes to the sectors that you as a panel are involved in, and providing those opportunities and highlighting them. Andy, I'm conscious I've held you back on this discussion. Did you want to come in and add anything further?
Yeah, not a huge amount to add, because I think great points have already been made. I think absolutely, yeah, I think we're all feeling it's palpable, the inequality that exists in not just the city but across our county. And yeah, there absolutely is a totally different agenda, I think, in levelling up, as the aspiration, as Claire calls it, and the sort of politicization of it at a government level. And we need to be very sort of wary of that. We're not an area of focus, but we know that we're somewhat unique, and I think that's the context in which we're working on Owned by Oxford, which is a community wealth building programme that Make Space is involved in with the City Council, with community action groups, Oxfordshire, Aspire, and Solidarity Economy Association. And that's about understanding that actually we do have an enormous amount of wealth here, and skills and expertise. And so it's not like some of the post-industrial towns that are actually struggling for any kind of economic opportunity, any kind of investment. Actually, we're swimming in it here. There's more than enough. It's just not evenly distributed. And so that's unique. And I think that's the narrative that we have to keep sort of transmitting. We have institutions with hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds in their endowments, and there is opportunities for some of that wealth to be redistributed, either through space and access to the high street, or through actually investing in the things that we all benefit from and celebrate, like the creativity that's been talked about. So all of that is, you know, is vital and key. But as well as investment, as well as redistribution, I'm also interested in economic autonomy. So this again is the idea around community wealth building. How do we build sustainable models where people can actually create ethical livelihoods, where they're able to generate an income that isn't just dependent on the government, the state, or you know, they need to play a part. They need to be a much bigger role. But in the short term, whilst people are actually just trying to survive and develop, we also need more autonomous ways of operating as well. And I think that can, you know, that's where I think exchange of ideas and knowledge and creativity and new business models is a space in which Make Space is particularly interested and would like to work much more closely across sectors to explore.
Thank you, Andy. I'm very conscious of time, and there's one further question that I have, but again, it aligns very, very closely from the question that Joe Ross has put into the chat bar. So thank you for that, Joe. I think we should probably focus on that particular one. Do any of the panelists have a vision for, in brackets, best case scenario, what Oxfordshire's high streets could look like in 5 to 10 years' time? My question was broadly aligned with that in terms of a wish list as to what needs to perhaps come forward to help our high streets, our towns and cities to continue to embrace creative and cultural aspirations that we have. Let's start with Anya. Anya, what's on your wish list?
I was just thinking, what do I want it to look like in 5 to 10 years? Vibrant, colourful, and thriving. That's really just the words that come to mind. Again, back to the wish list, probably an artist hub, like a proper hub, or not just one space, even only for dancers, for example, but like somebody mentioned, like, could there be a cultural quarter? Maybe, but I'd like to see the entire city be a cultural quarter, almost, like more artwork everywhere, more cafes where we can just, come together, and there's more music, and just a thriving, buzzing scene where we all feel drawn to, and hopefully all, as in not just us, few white people, but everyone from the global majority, and everyone that lives and is based in Oxford and Oxfordshire, that Oxford will be a real big draw for people to come and to just enjoy and be filled and be inspired. That's what I would love to see.
Sounds fantastic. I'm signed up to that already. Paul, how do you see things developing? What's on your wish list?
Well, I think everything that Anya said, would be my vision also. I think to have some space that is for different communities, that is like a proper, properly invested in, properly supported, properly promoted, that has real prominence in the physicality of the city. I mean, so much of the city is owned by the university, and therefore is very, is just architecturally exclusive of everyone, really, unless you're within the university population. So there is a real issue, I think, with being physically in the city, in this particular city. It's not true of all cities, but particularly this. It would be good to see some clearing out, some giving over by the city, for example, or the university, to spaces that can certainly be communities that at the moment lack any visibility and are underrepresented. And I think also opportunities for more organizations to be working away from their buildings and actually working in communities, including obviously on the high street. A further development of all of the amazing festivals and parades and that already animate the city, and for those to really be built upon and to be better promoted, I would say, by our DM, the destination marketing organizations that there are in Oxford, which I think, again, slightly calling things out, I think could do a better job of promoting arts and culture and driving people into Oxford and Oxfordshire more widely. But we've also got to, Andy made reference to ethics, and we do need to think about how all of this sits, though, in the context of other important values-led work, not only about inclusion and social equity, but also environmental responsibility. Do we really want people driving around everywhere, coming into places in the same way? One of the great benefits of the pandemic, for all of its disadvantages, has been that people weren't doing that, and the environmental gains around that, I think. So whatever we do to bring footfall back, be it through arts and culture, we have to ensure that we're doing that in a way that is also ethically responsible in relation to the environment. So my whole message really here is about sustainability. It's about having long-term investment for the benefit of artists, for those communities, to really drive placemaking, but to do that in a way that is also sustainable and ethical in relation to the other values-led work that, as arts and culture organizations, we're all thinking about at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and I think it's always, you're very right to talk about Oxford and Oxfordshire, and the fact that, and I'm as guilty as anyone for focusing on Oxford because it's the easy thing to do. More broadly in Oxfordshire, you've got a variety of world-class venues, assets, festivals, geographical locations like the Cotswolds, which people forget is very much a part of Oxfordshire too. So you're very right to raise that point. Claire, what's on your wish list?
Well, I don't know Oxford well enough or Oxfordshire well enough to comment on my wish list for Oxfordshire. But I guess what I hope for is that there will be a new form of public realm, and that our high streets will demonstrate a new form of public realm in which financial transaction isn't the primary motivating factor. So we will understand a whole range of reasons to gather together and have exchanges with others who we don't necessarily know, in a way that is enlivening and multi-generational and inclusive, and gives us a sense of being together. And I think that that engaging artists in that visioning of a new form of public realm will deliver incredible value and results. So that's my hope.
Thank you, Claire. Andy, final words to you. What's on your wish list, and where do you see things going?
Such a delicious question, isn't it? Nice to step out of the everyday for a moment and think further ahead. And yeah, I mean, I'd love to live in any of the futures that have been suggested there. Of course, in the context of make space and meanwhile use, we want to see thriving community, creativity and innovation in Oxfordshire's once empty and underused spaces. But I would also build on that and say that it is really about changing who owns and who shapes the places where we live and work and create, and see some real demonstrable steps towards the democratization of both the ownership of our towns and cities, but also who's making the decisions about how they're shaped and formed going forward to answer the social inequities that have been discussed, to respond to the climate emergency, and to represent the full breadth and colour and joy of humanity, rather than be based purely on metrics of rent and profit.
I think a really strong point to end the discussion there, Andy. Thank you so much.